All right, well, welcome everybody again. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about the tips and tricks of working with traumatized children. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Sierra Alexander. I am the clinical supervisor here at Chaddock School. So my job duties pretty much consist of overseeing the counseling department at the school and making sure that all of our students are receiving social and emotional needs in order for them to help function better in the classroom. I've also had experience working as a residential therapist with children and families in our residential program, as well as working direct care. So I've had a lot of different experiences working with children in different areas. So I'm excited to be talking to everybody today.
Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Mercer and I am the clinical supervisor at Chaddock's residential program, so I oversee the clinical direction in our residential program. I as well started off as a residential therapist. I have my master's in social work and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been working with children and families that have experienced trauma and trauma-related symptomology for approximately 8 to 9 years. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is just kind of go over a little bit about what is trauma and what the definition of trauma is. So trauma can be any type of event that creates a perceived life-threatening experience. And I want to emphasize the word perceived, because sometimes it may not have been a life experience. However, if the child or the individual experiences it as life-threatening, it then becomes traumatic to them. Not everybody experiences trauma in the same way. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are different forms of trauma. So I kind of want to give this over to our audience and ask people to type in or comment on different forms of trauma that they're familiar with. And we'll just give you guys a couple minutes here to type away.
I think another thing too, the tricky part about trauma is that, like Danielle said, it definitely differs from person to person. Most people may not think a car accident would be that traumatic, or, for example, tripping and falling up the stairs in front of, a boy they liked at school. To us, that may seem really natural, but given the composition of the child and where they come from, that could be something that can be very detrimental to them. It's really kind of thinking outside the box of what's traumatic, because sometimes, we just think the standard abuse, neglect, although those are huge, sometimes can also impact, the little things can also impact just as big as some of the more major things that we think about when we think about the word trauma.
Yes, so it looks like we have some participants.
We do. Divorce, death, developmental, pre-verbal, chronic stress, incarceration, homeless, also acute stress such as divorce and grief, parent incarcerated. And I think that's it for right now.
Absolutely, you guys did a great job. So Sierra hit on some of them. A car accident could be traumatic to some, abuse, neglect. Oh, there's one more.
Yes. Verbal yelling.
Verbal yelling, good. So that takes a form of emotional and verbal abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So you have different types of abuse. You have sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and in addition, Sierra had mentioned neglect. Some other forms of trauma are natural disasters. Another form of trauma that is, I believe, taking storm right now is bullying. Bullying has been a hot topic as of late, but we're seeing a lot of kids being impacted by bullying more and more, that lead to ongoing internal and external struggles that we'll talk a little bit about more. Exposure to a natural disaster. And it's also very important to realize and to recognize that sometimes individuals don't have to have experienced these personally for them to be seen as traumatic, but sometimes they can hear of somebody experiencing these or witness somebody experiencing them, and it will be just as traumatic. So for example, domestic violence, it may not be where the violence is directed towards the child, but the child witnesses the aggression between his parents, and that will be incredibly traumatic to them as well. So in addition to talking a little bit about what trauma is and what different forms of trauma there are, we also wanted to kind of hit on what are some of the symptomology that you will see or behaviors that you will see in a kid that have experienced trauma, because sometimes these are wham and right in your face, and then other times they're very subtle and very hidden. It all again depends on the child and what's been going on with them. So some of the things that are very common for kiddos that have experienced trauma are symptoms of re-experiencing, such as your flashbacks, nightmares, experiencing the event all over again, having physiological effects come up when they are around something that reminds them or triggers them of the event. You also have what we call as hyperarousal. That's another word for that hyperactivity, restlessness, fidgetiness, making sure they're aware of the environment, hypervigilance, so frozen watchfulness, knowing who's in the room, where the exits are, what's all around the room in order to feel a sense of control. And then lastly, you have your common avoidant symptomology, such as shutting down, withdrawing, removing themselves from the environment, isolating, not talking. So those are some common symptoms, but in addition to that, some of the behaviors that you're going to look at are kiddos that may exhibit superficially charming behaviors or attention-seeking behaviors, self-soothing behaviors such as self-harm or aggression towards others, towards themselves, towards animals, towards property. Other symptomology that you might experience is consistent lying. You might see kiddos that have a really difficult time expressing their feelings and expressing their emotions, so they shut down. They also may experience an excessive need to control. So what appears to be as demanding and bullying or intimidating behavior is just a strong desire to be able to control the environment as a means to feel a sense of safety. So does anyone in the audience have any additional symptoms or behaviors that they see in children that have experienced trauma, or they see on a daily basis working with their own kids?
And also being aware too, those things, that all the symptoms that Danielle mentioned can look very different in different environments, home, community, and school. I know we've worked with a lot of parents and families who say, well, my kid's fine at school, but at home he's really hard. Or parents say, he's okay at home, like he's really struggling in school or activities. And so being aware that, not all environments have the same triggers, but the symptoms may look different in each environment, giving how the child feels. We'll talk about felt safety a little bit more later, but depending on how safe the child feels in the environment will also depend on what behaviors you'll see. I know in my experience working at the school, what kind of Danielle talked about, we'll see a lot of, the typical knee shaking and bouncing. Some kids will rock back and forth when the environment's too loud. The cursing, the aggression, when the schoolwork is too hard sometimes, that also triggers some of their feelings within themselves. So that will often lead to refusal, failing grades, or just lack of engagement in the classroom. So they definitely take on very different forms, but there's always something underneath those behaviors that's obviously causing the symptoms. So do we have any?
We do have some responses. Verbal yelling, retreat into fantasy world,
Yes.
head down,
Yep.
yes, no answers only, and no eye contact.
Absolutely. Those are all good common behaviors that we see with kiddos that have experienced trauma. And before we move on to talk a bit about how to work with these kiddos, I think that it's also very important to know that when someone experiences trauma, it changes their brain chemistry. And so these kids really are doing the best that they can. It's just difficult because their brain chemistry has changed. And so research has shown when the trauma happens, our development stops. So if our child has experienced trauma at an early age, such as infancy or toddlerhood, at 16 years old, they may still be showing some behaviors that a toddler would show or an infant would show. And we may scratch our heads and wonder, why are they showing infantile or toddler-like behavior? Well, that's because the trauma happened when they were that age and their development stopped. And as a result of that, their brain chemistry adjusted to survive accordingly. So you may be looking at an increase in serotonin, an increase in cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. So all of these things that are activated in the brain system after a trauma occurs makes it that much difficult for a kiddo to be able to really cope and address their behaviors without adult support.
And another thing that sometimes we as adults don't necessarily think about, and Danielle kind of talked about, that developmental age. And I know somebody had mentioned things that have happened pre-verbally. So there's also that where trauma symptoms, we said, we know this kid's doing it on purpose, he knows that. A lot of times with kids who've experienced trauma, their brain may not remember, but their body physiologically remembers the trauma. So for an example, a kid who may have been in a house fire, as an infant, maybe every time the kid smells smoke, he reacts in a negative manner. So kind of just taking into consideration those things as well. They can't always, tie the way they're feeling and what they're thinking and what they're doing to the trauma. And so that's where kind of what we'll talk about later on kind of helps us be more aware of that and work with the child in an effective way.
Absolutely. Knowing the child's history is so important to be able to recognize what those triggers are, because sometimes it appears as if the triggers came out of nowhere, but there's always a trigger. We just unfortunately don't always know what those triggers are. Oftentimes they are related to the senses, such as a smell, a sound, a sight, a touch, a feel, something they taste. So for example, if one of their perpetrators used to wear Axe body spray when they go into the grocery store and a stranger passes them, and that stranger happens to be wearing Axe body spray, you may see a kiddo that has a temper tantrum in the grocery store. And it's not necessarily a temper tantrum, it's a trauma-related response.
Or it appears that nothing happened. You're like, well, what happened? You were just grabbing the eggs off the shelf just fine. So I think it's those things, just really kind of paying attention. And, unfortunately, working with some of the adopted kids that we have, sometimes we don't really always know what those traumas are. And so like Danielle said, the history is really important, but sometimes you just have to go with, what you're being given and, work with the symptoms and then what's underneath them, as opposed to really knowing per se what the trauma is.
So we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about some tips and tricks, unless anybody in the audience has any questions before we move on.
I guess I have to type and talk, so we have a couple minutes.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand it over to Sierra, and Sierra's going to talk a little bit about the importance of attunement and self-regulation.
So as we kind of mentioned, we listed off numerous trauma symptoms. So what attunement is really, when they say being attuned to your child, but it's more than that. It's really knowing and trying to experience what they're feeling and thinking. So being, paying attention to their daily routine. Like, what do you notice? An example would be every time, a school example would be every time the student is in math class, he tends to act out. What is it about math class that's, having him have behaviors? Is it the work too hard? Is it, something related to the atmosphere of the classroom? At home, it could be, anytime they're asked to do chores, the kid can't do chores. I can't understand why. And so trying to build your own little map for your child, and trying to pick up on the little things that they're doing to kind of help prevent some of those outbursts or struggles that they're having. So being attuned is being able to kind of feel what they're feeling and get down to their level, and be able to provide what they need at that time, whether that's a snack or some touch, just maybe a hand on the shoulder or a high five, or just just sitting next to them without any words. And also, paying attention to their facial expressions, their mannerisms. Because being attuned with, the children you're working with or the children that you have is going to be key in also advocating for them and helping other people see beyond the behaviors and what's going on with the child. I don't know if you want to add any more about attunement.
I think you nailed it, but kind of just emphasizing on the importance of being able to really read your child before they they have to tell you what's going on. It's so important that we as adults are able to read our children, especially our kiddos that have experienced trauma, because a lot of them don't have the verbal language to connect what they're feeling inside, and to communicate that to the outside world. So I just also want to emphasize the importance of physical touch, as Sierra had described, because we talked a lot about, or I touched briefly on the brain chemistry. Well, touch also produces brain chemistry, and it increases the positive brain chemistry we want kids to have in order to learn, in order to be able to put words to their feelings, in order to be able to accomplish tasks. And so someone had mentioned shutting down as a trauma symptom. So if you notice a kiddo that's shutting down, the power in moving close to them and just putting your hand on their shoulder, and what that can do to help that child. Okay, she sees me, she notices me, she recognizes that I'm having a rough time, but I don't have to necessarily talk about it right now, because talking sometimes and processing sometimes is too difficult for our kids, even though we as adults get really stuck in, let's talk about this, let's figure this out, we want to help you. Sometimes the best help is a simple hand on the shoulder.
And that kind of goes into self-regulation. We talk about as infants, when they're younger, the parents there, to respond to all the different cries, hunger, needing a diaper change, needing, clothing, needing care, attention, and eye contact. And some of those kids who are had trauma and attachment early on, those things are difficult for them to do as adults. So it's being able to, us, the rocking of, when a baby is fussy. So that's where the touch kind of comes into play. You're helping self-regulate, and you're doing that by co-regulating. So using you as the tool in the intervention to help them, calm or to feel safe. In many other ways to self-regulate, we talk about fidgets. We use a lot of fidgets here. It's just things for them to kind of, piddle around with their hands, and to kind of take attention off certain things. So that can be like a ball, or one of those like squishy toys, or those new fidget spinners and fidget cubes. Those are all the rage right now, although we've had them for years. But I think those are those things to kind of pay attention to is, and also, me personally, like I'm a big doodler. You looking at my planner, you see little smiley faces or hearts here and there, but I can do that, but I can still focus. But that helps me kind of regulate and stay focused if my hands are busy. And same thing, like, at home, like doing homework, like I talked about, like the shaking or the rocking, using other objects, they talk about weighted blankets or that, that pressure to help them regulate. And also we talk about matching as well. And what I mean by matching is kind of coming in on their level where they are. If they're, up here, you say, oh my gosh, something is really, really happening right now. And then lowering your voice and having them bring it down as well. Oh my gosh, why don't you come sit next to me and we'll figure it out. And just kind of bringing your tone down as well, because that helps them regulate that just they're up here, with their voice tones or behaviors. And you're kind of coming in saying, oh my gosh, I feel that you're super overwhelmed right now, but why don't we sit here and do this together? And it's in bringing that down.
Just to tag off that real quickly, I think a beautiful example of that is if you think about that baby in the crib and you think about the baby crying, whether she's hungry, whether she's wet, whether she just wants her mommy, the mommy comes in and says, oh my God, honey, here's mommy, here I am. And then you pick the baby up and you, shh, it's okay. And then you start to lower your voice and you start to whisper. So you're matching that baby's scream by coming in and saying, mommy's here, mommy's here. And then you're bringing your voice tone down at a whisper, gradually seeing that baby's crying, coming back down to a whimper, and then to no more. So when you're thinking about co-regulation and the importance of co-regulation, really think about that baby in the crib and what the mother does as a means to help that baby stop crying. So if that baby is crying and the mom comes in and starts yelling at that baby, the baby's not going to stop crying. So when you have a child that's yelling at you at home because you didn't get their favorite kind of juice at the store, even though you tried to get their favorite kind of juice, but they were out and your child just doesn't recognize that, kind of following with what Sierra said. Oh my gosh, I know you really, really wanted that juice, and I wasn't able to get it for you because they were out. Oh my goodness, we might have to go back next week to see if they have it. So you notice I got super excited to match that kid, and then I came back down with my voice. And co-regulation is such a huge piece of working with kiddos that have experienced trauma, especially at early age and pre-verbal trauma, because in order to self-regulate, one has to learn what regulation is, and they do that through an adult caregiver. So if you've had a child that has not had an adult caregiver or an inconsistent adult caregiver, they haven't had someone to come in and pick them up when they're crying, most probably their ability to self-regulate or to use fidgets or to use doodle or to use any kind of coping skill, they just aren't going to be able to unless they have an adult teaching them how to co-regulate, to learn how to self-regulate. And so kiddos that have not experienced an ability to self-regulate and have had absent co-regulation, oftentimes you are going to see kiddos that self-harm, are physically aggressive, or are shut down and withdrawn because they just don't know how to do it any different.
And I know I mentioned briefly talking about snacks. Being hangry is a real thing. And these kids, we talked about the brain development. Their brain isn't developed the way it should be. So that's where the adults need to come in and be cognizant of, are you asking this kid to do a lot of work when they haven't had breakfast or a good breakfast? Or, lunch, for example, or dinner, making sure they say feed and water the kids every 2 hours. It's one of those things where, us as adults, we morning drags on until lunchtime, and then once we get our food, the afternoon tends to go a little bit better. So just keeping in mind, if you're asking a kid to do some hard things or be go, making sure you're providing them with high protein snacks, and just to kind of help feed their brain and fuel their body, because they work extra hard to kind of keep it together and to get through the day. And so making sure that you're feeding them accordingly to kind of help them continue to move throughout the day.
Because the main idea is, how are we going to keep our kiddos' brains optimally regulated? So in this window of tolerance where they're not super, super hyperactive and over the top and aggressive, or they're not completely shut down, avoidant, withdrawn, and isolated. We have this small window with these kiddos that have experienced trauma, and one of the best ways to keep them in that window of tolerance is through providing them food and water every 2 hours. So just remember that, especially with our kiddos that have experienced significant neglect. They don't know when they're going to eat next based off of their experiences. So you may have shown them for 7 years that you are always going to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but the body never forgets the feeling of being starved. So for them, maybe carrying a bag of peanuts in their pocket around the whole day would be incredibly helpful, because they at least know, I have something to eat when I'm hungry, and I don't have to starve again. So little things like that can go a really long way.
So kind of everything that we've talked about encompassing in working with the kids that you have and we have. So structure, engagement, nurture, and challenge are ways that we continually work with students and kids who exhibit trauma and attachment symptoms. So Danielle and I are going to kind of expand on. So structure is having a plan, having a schedule, and there being predictability. So there needs to be clear-cut directions. I'm asking you to do X, Y, and Z. There needs to be a beginning, middle, and end to the things that you're doing with these kids. And letting them, if they can predict and know what's coming up next, that provides, again, I talked about earlier, that felt safety. They know what's going to happen. They know what they have control of. And also, that gives you an inclination. If you have a structure and have a plan and have things laid out, it also helps you build that attunement as well, because you're going to be able to know what certain things they can and can't handle throughout the day. So structure and predictability are huge in working with these types of students and children, because they need structure, because structure is safety. They may resist it, very much so. But I think that's where, the adults come in and, and say, these are your options, this is what we're doing, giving them 3 choices. Because if you give them A or B, sometimes those aren't really considered choices. Either you do this or this happens. And making sure those choices and those options you're giving them are things that you're okay with, and things that you can manage. An example would be, if you don't do your homework, then you're going to be grounded for a week. Is that really, what does that look like? Is that obtainable? That's a really long amount of time. And so making sure that there's not a lot of, having good structure is taking the ambiguity out of things. They need to know what's going on in order to continue to progress to do the things that they need to do.
And just in regards to choices provides a sense of control for our kiddos. And as I discussed earlier, control is so important to these kids that have experienced trauma. So the best is to provide as many choices as we possibly can, even if they seem super small. So for example, would you like a red cup or would you like a blue cup for dinner? And your child says, I want a purple cup. What an awesome choice, buddy. High five. Let me get that purple cup for you, because it provided, 1, a deposit in terms of your relationship, but 2, it provided them a sense of control. And is it really a big issue that they had a purple cup compared to a red or a blue? Or you may be lucky and you might have a kid that says, blue cup, that's great. And then you provided the choice, you were good with that. It was a deposit on your relationship and it provided him a sense of control. So just remember, providing choices is so incredibly important, but they have to be choices that you're comfortable with, as Sierra said. So the next thing we're going to talk about is engagement and how to engage children that have experienced trauma. So a lot of that is surrounding how are we providing them opportunities for shared joy and connection, and what are we doing to help them feel unique and special about themselves. So engagement is really about noticing what is special about them, unique about them. So for example, noticing, wow, Sierra, I noticed you brought your big green eyes today. That's awesome. High five. Yes. And doing something like that to catch them out of surprise and notice what is, like I said, unique, not about their physical appearance. So not about, wow, that's a nice sweater you have on, I like your boots, but really what is unique about them. So for example, Sierra might have a freckle on her hand right here. I don't know if you can see it from that far, but she has a freckle on this hand, and no one else in the whole world is going to have that freckle. This freckle is Sierra's freckle and Sierra's freckle only, because a lot of these kids haven't had people to explore them and get excited about them and really see who they are. So again, when you're thinking about that baby and the things that we notice when we're mothers and we see the baby and we see how, oh my God, their eyes are turning from blue to brown. Look at that, buddy. Oh my God, here's a new freckle on your knee. I've never seen that before. Or look at these fingers and how strong your fingers are getting and your hands are getting so big. So we explore the baby's bodies and everything is a new surprise to us, and we make it this big deal. Why aren't we doing that with all kids?
And you say, can I do this with my teenager? Oh, of course you can.
Yes, you can.
You would be surprised how many teenagers respond to those notices. And they may kind of give you a look if you have like that really sing-songy voice like Danielle had, but I mean, you can change it up. Oh wow, I see that yeah, like you brought a happy smile to class today, or you brought a happy smile, back from school. I noticed that about you. That's cool. Give me a high five. Like it can be very, cool, if you would put it, so to speak. I mean, you could definitely adapt it to the kid, but those, you'd be surprised how many, older kids and adolescents with trauma attachment will really seek that out once you show that to them.
Yes, you would be surprised how many kids I was able to how many 18-year-olds, in fact, I was able to find special and unique freckles about them. And every single time they saw me, if I didn't see them first, they would run up to me and say, look at the freckle, it's still there. Count my fingers. How many fingers do I have? So you would think, remember, we're speaking to where they're at developmentally, not chronologically. So you might have an 18-year-old that is or a 6-year-old that's stuck in an 18-year-old body. And so you're really wanting to speak to that 6-year-old, not that 18-year-old.
So that kind of leads right into nurture. So we've already talked a lot about touch, kind of the high fives are great. A simple, just, hey, looks like you're doing great on your homework today. Or, hey, why don't you come sit next to me on the couch, we're watching a movie. It just those little interactions, or, you see them doing their chore, just, a brush as you walk by, or just that proximity. And sitting, whatever your hobbies may be, if they're sitting and doing homework or doing a chore, just coming and sitting in the room with them and providing that closeness and nurture. Taking care of them if they get, boo-boos or owies. And same thing go for teenagers. Oh, wow, look like you really, scuffed up your knee on the skateboard. Why don't you come in, let me help you out. And you providing the Band-Aid and the ointment and stuff like that. Also, cooking is a great way to show nurture as well, and get kids engaged in those things, being next to them, showing them. And as well as, what are a couple of things that you mentioned about? Well, they kind of go along with engagement.
You could create like special handshakes with your kiddo or with your student. You could make sure that every day you're doing I love you rituals before bedtime. So are you reading your child a story before bedtime? Are you tucking them in at bedtime? Are you brushing their hair? Or are you expecting the child all to do these things on their own? So when you're working with kiddos that have experienced trauma, they really feel as if they have to be in control of the world, or their world is going to collapse on them, and they have to learn that the adults can still be in control of the world and it's okay, and they can still be safe. And we're doing that by providing them those predictable routines of bedtime stories and tucking them in and giving them a kiss on their forehead, or every single day, if it's a student in your classroom, you have a special handshake with that student that you do as they walk in. So things like that. Touch is incredibly important, and we know that it's something that sometimes these kiddos resist. And so please, if you have someone that or a kid that resists that, trying to sneak it in as you can is incredibly important. Yes, they will. High fives and the fist bumps nowadays, right? Woo. Oh, blow up.
No, I mean, anytime you can engage a kid in any time, and so that kind of goes on a challenge. So you want to challenge them in ways to be successful. And that's where you can, sneak the nurture in, like, okay, how many high fives can we do in, 5 seconds or whatever, and be able to challenge them. And to us, it may seem as though that seems pretty small or silly, but you're making that challenge and that connection, and they're being successful. It may seem like it's, I guess an example would be for like, a teenager, we do like tearing up newspaper. Like that seems relatively easy, but you know that kid's going to be successful at it. And so you want to set them up for that, because they're going to have a lot, and they've already had a lot of failures and disappointments that they perceive. So being able to challenge them at their developmental level, and not always, the way other people see them. And so that's probably the best way. And nurture's kind of underlining with all of those. And any type of structure, engagement, or challenge, nurture's always going to kind of be floating around.
And just remember with challenge, the focus is on increasing their self-esteem. So as like Sierra said, if you create a task that they are not going to be able to complete or capable of doing, and or you try to trick them to make it hard, you're contradicting the whole purpose of what your goal is, and that's increasing self-esteem. So we really want to make sure that we are giving them tasks that they can accomplish. So if you're working with kids in a classroom, looking at, is this assignment for this specific kid too long? Do I need to adapt it and adjust it and make it his question? Maybe he only has 3 questions compared to 5 questions because he's only capable of completing 3. And then you gradually adding another question and then another question, because the whole purpose is to help him feel competent and confident in what he's doing. It's not to get the work done, it's to feel good about what he's doing, because if he can't do 5, he's going to show you he can't do 5 in a way that we don't want him to show us he can't do 5. So why not just adapt it for that kid to 3, so then he can feel accomplished and he can feel successful, feel good about himself, and we avoid a potential problem in the school.
And I mean, and a quick example too of, a challenge in the home is, asking your kid to fold and put away his laundry. That seems relatively kosher for most people, but looking at a kid who may have motor development, folding laundry is probably going to be pretty difficult. And so you may get a kid who wads everything up and shoves it in his drawer. Oh, look, Mom, I put it away. It's great. So doing those things with them and saying, how many t-shirts, let's do it together. Let's race. So those types of things and doing it along with them initially. And you may have to ask them and show them how to fold their laundry every single time. But at least you're making that connection, showing that nurture and engagement, and still challenging them to do something a little bit different. So we're going to kind of finish up with PACE. So PACE, playful, accepting, curious, and empathic. I always say it wrong. So in order to engage with students and children who have trauma and attachment symptoms, being playful is very important. Being able to laugh at the little things, being able to accept when you may be doing something a little silly, or even when you make a poor choice. Oh man, that was very silly of me. Let me try again. Can I have a redo? Redos are also going to be your best friend as well. If a kid's doing something that's not the desired result, saying like cursing, for example, can we have a redo? Can we try that again? When they're using inappropriate language, let's try that again. You're not shaming them, you're giving them another shot. And most of the time kids will respond pretty well to that. So be able to be playful with that. And identifying things that you're good at and kind of making them your own. Use your diversity and uniqueness to yourself. Like, I'm a real big Harry Potter nerd. So I tend to try and, make that connection with the kids. Like, oh, you read Harry Potter too? That's so cool. And be silly and be able to kind of get on their level with certain things. Music is another thing to kind of be playful with, and here, let's sing the song together, and they might roll their eyes and be like, oh, but that's another way to make that connection. Accepting. So you talked.
Let me add one thing.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it's just incredibly important because sometimes when we are playful, our tones can come across sarcastic.
That's true.
Just as adults, it's very common, but our kids that have experienced trauma don't always understand sarcasm. So just be very, very aware of your tones, that when you're playful, it is coming across very warm and playful and not sarcastic. I just felt like that's a very important disclaimer.
And that's something I think, me personally, I really have to work at, because I'm quite sarcastic at times. So I think really just being aware of, definitely how you're coming across. And your tones and your cadence is also very important. Because when I say, oh my gosh, that must have been so hard for you, or gee, why don't you try that again, as opposed to, oh my gosh, that must have been so hard for you. Come on, why don't we try that again? It really is going to make an impact on the desired response that you want from the child. That's a really good point. So accepting. So playful, accepting is the A in PACE. It's just being accepting of who they are and where they're at. I mean, that one's pretty self-explanatory. That these kids come from hard places and there's things that they struggle with, and, not holding that against them. And accepting the cursing behavior and the aggression, and understanding that it comes, from a place that they don't truly understand and they're trying to figure out. So just really being aware of what your buttons are and why you may find the fact that, this kid always kicks the door instead of knocking, how come that's bothering you? And really being, self-aware of, who you are and how you can contribute to the situation. Because a lot of times, your buttons, the kids will pick up on quicker than you think. And so being really accepting and kind of asking for redos yourself when, things you might get worked up or out of hand. That's one thing that's really hard. If you can have that humility within yourself and say, you're right, I screwed up. Please let me try that again.
It's so important. It's so important because we're asking these kids to recognize and admit when they're wrong, or when they make poor choices, and to have some type of accountability. It's only fair that we have the same respect for us as adults. And it goes so far with these kids when they're like, what? An adult's able to admit when they're wrong, when they have had adults in their lives that oftentimes have treated them pretty poorly. So that goes a very far way.
And then next in the C in PACE is being curious. So, I wonder, or gee, I'm curious, or you said this, I'm just really confused. Can you help me understand? It's a way to connect with them without being accusatory, or like, why'd you do that? Or, geez, every single time I tell you to do the dishes, you never do it. I'm really curious. Every time, it's time to do the dishes, you always just get so mad and start out to your room. I'm so confused. Can you help me understand? It kind of puts you in that way, or making that connection with them, and making it not feel like it's something that's bad about them or that they're not good enough. And making the guests like, I'm just curious. I wonder if you're feeling really sad right now when, so-and-so said this to you. Or, I wonder if doing the dishes is really hard for you and you maybe need some help. Because they'll tell you when you're wrong. And then usually it'll be like, well, no, I don't like to do the dishes because, the water's too hot. Oh, okay, great. Well, that's something I can help you with. So it's just really, you'd be surprised by how curiosity really can kind of give you some different and unique responses, and also to kind of get underneath of what's going on with them.
And just remember, with curiosity, it's a deep desire of wanting to know what is going on with the kid. Mm-hmm. So these kids are going to know whether we're being genuine. So if you're being curious just to practice the skill, that's wonderful. We want you to definitely practice the skill, but just know that there has to be this deep interest of a genuine wonder. What is it about the dishes? What is it about the dishes, or is it about the time of day? We gotta figure this one out. I'm just really curious about it. I'm stumped. Help me. So it's a really deep, passionate desire of wanting to understand what's going on with the kiddo at that time.
And then empathic's the last one. And that, everything you do with these kids, it's having empathy and understanding where they came from. Putting yourself in your shoes, like, how would I function if something terrible happened to me in this manner? And some of you might have already experienced some trauma and attachment yourself, and have been able to work on it in many different ways. And so you being able to just have empathy for how hard it is to put words to their feelings, how hard it is to accept, the bad things that have happened to them. And having that loving and empathetic tone, when you're talking to them, without the sarcasm, without being curious. It's just having that understanding, accepting of who they are and where they came from, and how, like we talked about early in development, they never got that. And so empathy, I think, it's probably one of the most important ones, because you can't really do the PAC without having empathy behind what you're doing and the genuineness that Danielle had talked about.
I think it's just really, really important to remember that these kids are doing the best that they can. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it seems like they're not, or it looks like they're not, or it feels like they're not, but they really are doing the best that they can in that moment. And sometimes their best is going to look different depending upon the day. Yeah. So just that kind of will keep you to remember the empathy, because based off of the way that their brain is wired, for whatever reason, in this moment, whatever they're asked to do is just really hard for them, but they're doing the best they can.
And it just kind of on an end note, is looking for the small instances of change. Because working with these kids, having these kids in your home, it's tough work. And so we want to look at the little things. When you asked them to fold their laundry, they said, F you, I'm not doing it. And you came in and used, the empathy, the tone, and then the next day said, hey, hey honey, it's time to do your laundry. I don't want to do it. Did they curse? No. They just said they didn't want to do it. So it may seem you're still trying to get them to do the laundry, but they didn't curse this time. Mm-hmm. The next time you might try, I don't really want to do it, and
praise, I guess. Yes, and praise those and say, yes. Good job, buddy, for not cussing when you told me you didn't want to do your laundry today. That's awesome.
So yeah, like I said, just trying to look for anything different. And, success comes in small doses. We're not looking for, huge changes, because it takes a long time to get to where you're going with a lot of these kids. So, all right, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I'll let you folks type in. It's probably the most awkward question.
Yes, please feel free to join us with any questions right now by typing into the chat section, and we'll relay those. Also, we do have a new resource online that's just getting started called traumaattachmentcenter.com. It's traumaattachmentcenter.com, where we'll have some blogs up by some of our child therapists. So if you're interested, please log on and take a look at that as well.
And for you parents that are participating today, another thing that I think is super important is I strongly encourage each and one of you to get into your own therapy if you are parenting a child that has experienced trauma. Because as Sierra said, these kids are really, really tough. And we experience what we call secondary trauma. So it's trauma that you have experienced having parented a child that have experienced trauma. And then if some of you have experienced your own adverse childhood experiences, all of that can come up to the surface when parenting kiddos that have experienced trauma. So the best thing for everybody parenting a child with trauma is getting into their own individual therapy.
As we talk as staff members, if you don't work your shoes, the kids will work for you.
And if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of the kids.
Very much so.
It looks like we have a question.
We do. How and when should consequences be given when a trauma child has a repeated behavior, such as cussing, hitting, etc., and when discussion isn't solving?
So that's a very good question.
Very common.
And it is a very common question. So the short story is that when you provide consequences to a child that have experienced trauma, you are also going to have to consequence yourself. And what I mean by that is if this kiddo is having a really hard time with cussing and hitting, then that's telling us that he has not yet developed the skills of self-regulation. And so what I would say to that kiddo is, wow, Johnny, it seems like we're having a really hard time staying safe and keeping our hands to ourselves. So until we're able to do that, you and I are going to be spending lots of time together, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you have safe hands. Okay? So that would mean that that child would have to go with you to whatever errand you're running, to whatever meeting you may have. And hopefully you have a good support system. So if you had somewhere you had to go where the child wasn't available, you could tag team, whether that be with your spouse, whether it be with another relative, a pastor, or whomever, because what that child is saying is he needs more co-regulation and he needs the adults to help him maintain regulation.
And consequences need to be natural and logical as well. Is grounding for, an extended period of time really going to be helpful? So really kind of thinking about those consequences and do they fit the behavior? And that's sometimes can be differ from typical parenting. So yes.
We have another question. How can you keep kids safe at school during unstructured playground time and when triggers cause impulsivity? An example would be pushing someone off of equipment.
Okay. I guess kind of working at the school and, kind of observing kids on the playground, there is typically, maybe 2 or 3 teachers or parents that kind of observe, 40 kids. My recommendation would be to help that kid identify a plan for recess. What are you going to do at recess today? Well, I'm going to swing on the swings, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. So that they kind of know what to do, and it kind of prevents that getting kind of tied up in other activities. Because a lot of times impulsivity is not knowing what's coming next and like what's going on and what's happening. So let me tell you, let's talk about what you're going to do at recess today. Okay, you're going to swing for 5 minutes. Would you like me to come tell you when your 5 minutes is up to move on to your next activity? Because you don't want to say have the kid, stay next to the adult, but if that's the case, then that's what it might have to be. But starting with that and really being more planful and predictable what that time at the recess is going to be, and maybe having them only identify 1 or 2 friends, to spend some time with during recess. So I think having a plan and being predictable, and if you have to kind of keep an extra eye or kind of coach them through, hey Johnny, you said you're going to swing for 5 minutes. It's only been 2. You got a couple more minutes. Which with a lot of kids, I know that's difficult. But if they kind of already know and you give them those prompts, that would be a good place to start.
And just remember that transitions and unstructured time is the hardest time for our kids that have trauma. Without that sense of structure, there's not that predictability, and they start to feel unsafe, and so then they make unsafe choices. So providing as much structure around the unstructured time as possible and predictability. Start preparing for it from the very beginning of the day. Okay guys, at noon we're going to have recess and we're going to have safe hands with each other. The other thing is being able to, if you were to have that kiddo pull him off to the side, using some of that curiosity of like, wow Johnny, I'm noticing at recess you have lots and lots of energy, and sometimes your hands just get away from yourself. What do you think's going on? What do you think it is? It is about recess that makes it so hard. So really trying to figure out what is underneath the behavior, what is underneath the pushing, and is it just simply he has too much energy and it's too high stimulus for him, and so he needs an adult to provide him more low stimulus activities in order to exude that energy.
Or they need to run 3 laps around the playground before they play. And burn off some energy. So, any other ones? All right. Well, those are 2 really good questions.
They are.
And I think, again, kind of going back to the team, it really kind of knowing what your kid's going to need in that moment, but also kind of help come up with those consequences and, ways to intervene. So, all right. Well, this was good.
Yes, thank you so much. And if you guys have any further questions or thoughts or just want to reach out, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Knowledge Center and they will get us in contact with each other.
Great.
Alrighty.
Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, guys.